get here in time, particularly with the rain falling. So look, thanks very much for coming down. I'll just start with a couple of house things. First thing I want to remind everyone is don't forget that your spouses are entitled to have free membership here. We want to encourage as many people as possible. It may be that you love the fact that the FCCT is your bolt hole away from family. But if you do get on with your spouse and you want him or her to join, by all means get them to do so because it's free. In terms of upcoming panels and events, next Wednesday we've got a panel looking at religious tolerance in Thailand, or what might be better described as the increasing intolerance amongst faiths. It's a very kind of button issue, and I think it'll be a very interesting evening when we get onto it. The day after, on Thursday, we've got our usual quiz. For a start, there's a bunch of very good prizes up for grabs, as always. It's usually a long, boozy session that's good fun, and we are going to slightly change the format for this one, so it should be a bit more entertaining. And some of the questions have been pretty tricky in the last couple of quizzes, so we're going to make it a little bit more accessible, we hope. So please come down; it is good fun. On October 12th, we're going to put a discussion together on to mark the 40th anniversary of the Thammasat University massacre. It's still one of the most painful and largely undiscussed chapters of Thailand's recent history. It's a particularly fraught memorial as well, I guess, given the fact that the military are back in power, and I think it would be very interesting to revisit that subject 40 years on and see what it means for Thailand now. We also have an upcoming movie night. There's a Dutch filmmaker called Martin Payens. He's going to show a film he's done. It's looking at a French village where the mayor of the French village predicted that the apocalypse would happen and that his village would be the only safe place to be during the apocalypse in 2012, which obviously didn't happen because we're all still here. But apparently it's quite entertaining, and it's kind of about how media hype, the media descended upon the village, and given the apocalypse didn't happen, they had nothing else to report on. So they started shooting themselves in increasingly more surreal and weird situations. So I think that would be a nice movie night as well. But let's get on to our main event tonight, covering the regional patch. Sorry, I didn't even introduce myself at the beginning, and apologies. This is the first time I've moderated, so some of you might know who I am. I'm Jerome Taylor with AFP News Agency based in Bangkok, and I cover kind of Southeast Asian region. Covering this regional patch over the past couple of years, one of the things that struck me is just how much China dominates our news coverage, either directly or indirectly. It's a huge, complex, and at times seemingly impenetrable country, particularly from here, and yet it has such a huge footprint on the region. Under the leadership of Xi Jinping, China is engaged in an increasingly muscular foreign policy while clamping down on critics both home and abroad. It's also coincided with Obama's so-called pivot to Asia, an often distracted realignment that was capped off just last week by Obama's last visit, what we think will be his last visit to Asia, and it was the 11th of his administration when he went to Laos. And it's my own personal view, but I just feel like we don't cover China enough at the FCCT, and I want to start to rectify that. It's a country we can't ignore, and it has such a huge footprint. So this is the first of what I hope will be a number of panels where we'll look at China more often. So I'm delighted to have a great panel tonight, and we've got speakers with a wealth of knowledge about our giant northern neighbour. To begin, we have Kobsak Chutikom. He's a veteran Thai diplomat. His first diplomatic dealings with China actually date back to before Bangkok and Beijing restored diplomatic ties, when he accompanied one of the Thai badminton teams as part of the kind of warming of the ties, restoration of those ties. He's had diplomatic postings in Washington, the UN and Czech Republic. He's worked for the WTO. He also entered Thailand's heady domestic political scene from 2000 with Chart Thai Party. And he's currently Secretary General of the Asian Peace and Reconciliation Council. We have next to him Jason Ng, who's very kindly flown over from Hong Kong to be with us tonight. His latest book is Umbrellas in Bloom, and it's pretty much the first one available that compiles in one place a detailed explanation for the remarkable protests that took place in Hong Kong in late 2014 and 2015. You might argue the movement failed to win that many concessions from Beijing at the time, but just weeks ago we saw Hong Kong voters turn out to return a whole new generation of young Democrat politicians who are deeply suspicious and wary of Beijing. He's also the author of 2 other books about Hong Kong, No City for Slow Men and Hong Kong State of Mind. When he's not writing books, he's also a lawyer. Don't hold it against him. And he's an adjunct associate professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Hong Kong. And finally, we have Benjamin Zawacki. Some of you will probably know him from his days as a regional researcher with Amnesty International. More recently, he's been working on an upcoming book titled Thailand, Shifting Ground Between the US and a Rising China. So I think his research is both recent and perfectly placed to talk about the constantly changing relationships in this region, particularly when it comes to Beijing. So without further ado, let's kick off. And I thought I'd go first to Jason because of the recent elections in Hong Kong, which were only just a few weeks ago. And we'll start with him just in terms of what he sees for the city and what it means for China.
Thank you very much, Jerome, for the introduction. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here at the FCCT, and it's very exciting to see young faces on my right side because it's so important for young people to get interested in politics, so I'm very encouraged by that. When Jerome first put together sort of this panel and told me that the topic is going to be the ever-growing footprint of China, I thought it really was a nice way of saying the overreaching tentacles of China. Being economically, I mean, we have, China has the One Belt, One Road sort of ambition. Militarily, it has been very active in the South China Sea, building artificial islands that they claim to be non-military, but satellite pictures really suggested anything but. And then it tried very hard to intervene in the Taiwan general election earlier this year, and it also tried very hard to intervene in the parliamentary election in Hong Kong last week. So I think this is a very good moment to sort of pause, take a step back, and really look at the relationship between China and the rest of the jurisdictions in the region. And me being based in Hong Kong, born and raised in Hong Kong, I'm very, very happy to talk about sort of how that plays out in Hong Kong, and maybe we can draw some lessons from that. I'm going to speak for 20 minutes. That's the amount of time allocated to me. And I'll try to sort of organize it logically. I'll start with a refresher. I understand in the audience there are people very, very knowledgeable in Hong Kong, but maybe there are sort of younger people who may not know Hong Kong as well. So I will start with a refresher to sort of set the stage for, and you know, also for the Q&A, maybe you can make a reference to some of the historical and political backdrop I will sort of set for you. And then I will go on to talk about where we are, and then obviously where we're going next. So everybody looks sort of very serious in this room because it's the FCC. I'm a member of the FCC in Hong Kong, and I know how sort of panels work, and I always try to relax my audience by asking them some questions. By a show of hand, you don't have to talk, right? How many people were in Hong Kong during 2014, during the Occupy movement? Oh, one, excellent, two. And second question, in Thailand, during sort of the outbreak of the Occupy movement, was the movement portrayed positively or negatively in Thailand? Positively, put up your hand. So or people just shy? Oh, so
this is for there have been many movements in Thailand.
No,
the most recent round.
Hong Kong Occupy movement.
Oh, Hong Kong, right, sorry.
How was it portrayed in the Thai media?
Positive?
Positively? Okay, yeah. Because I just gave a talk to a bunch of Singaporean students 2 days ago. I asked the same question, and they said unequivocally negative. It was portrayed in Singapore as very sort of destructive to the local economy. The student protesters were rioters, and they had no regard for law and order, which sort of was very different from obviously the way it was portrayed in Hong Kong and apparently in Thailand as well. Okay, so that's good, and it's important for me to know sort of how it was characterized in Thailand, for me to get a sense of how to approach this audience. Okay, excellent. So, Hong Kong, fishing village, ceded to the British in 1842 after the first Opium War. I assume people sort of have a vague idea of that. Became a British colony for 150 years, yeah, and then sort of handed back to China in the year 1997. Now, back in the 70s and the 80s, right, the negotiation between Britain, the UK and China began, right? And so people put their head together to sort of find a way forward. What are we going to do with Hong Kong? What are we going to do with this foster child who have been raised by a white family, going to be handed back to the biological Chinese parents, whom they don't really like, right? So what are we going to do with that problem foster child? And just the idea of Hong Kong going back to a communist regime scared a lot of people away. And so in the late 70s and 80s, during the negotiation, during the Sino-British negotiation, there was a mass exodus of Hong Kong elite, right? Sort of people who have the means to pick up and go. So we're talking about, the doctors and lawyers and professionals, bankers, accountants, and wealthy businessmen. And at the time, the paramount leader of China, Deng Xiaoping, saw that, well, we don't really want to sort of leave a sort of vacuum of elite in Hong Kong, and so I must say or do something in order to stop the brain drain. And so that's when sort of the idea of this semi-autonomous city, one country, two system idea was first hatched. And then 1984, the joint declaration was signed, and that sort of memorialized the ongoing negotiation between the two world powers. And then obviously we have the handover, July 1, 1997. That was the anticlimax of the decade, or of the century, because people thought, when the clock struck midnight, it's going to be all scary, Hong Kong is going to be painted red, but none of that happened, right? So people were very relieved and thought, big hoopla. I mean, we spent all these years planning, and then all these people leaving Hong Kong and becoming sort of, immigrants in North America, Australia, New Zealand, and now we can all come back, right? But at the same time, sort of behind the scenes, and while people were celebrating the smooth handover, the Basic Law kicked into effect. And the Basic Law basically memorialized the arrangement that Hong Kong will remain a city separate from China under the one country, two systems banner. It's going to enjoy a high degree of autonomy, meaning that all affairs other than national defense and foreign affairs will be decided by Hong Kong people. But as we will soon see, that is sort of fast becoming a myth. Okay, so that was fine. And then, so our first chief executive is what we call our president, right? Or our mayor, because Hong Kong is a city. Cheng Chi-Hua, sort of came into power. He's a businessman. He's like the man of bad luck, right? So he during his reign, there was sort of this SARS outbreak. There was obviously the 97, 98 financial crisis that affected not only Hong Kong, but it actually started in Thailand. And then spread throughout the region. And so the original idea that Deng Xiaoping had, that Hong Kong is going to be, or they're going to take a very hands-off approach of Hong Kong, sort of went away because Hong Kong was becoming a little unhinged, a little unmanageable, because the leader was not that effective. Meanwhile, the economy tanked. There's a lot of anxiety in society. And so that's really was, the year 2003 was perhaps the turning point for Hong Kong-China relationship, when Beijing leadership felt I don't think hands up is such a good idea. I think we need to micromanage a little bit. And that's when the liaison office, right, which is sort of the de facto Chinese consulate or Chinese embassy in Hong Kong, that's when the liaison office in Hong Kong became very powerful, because they were vested with the power from top leadership, from the Politburo, to really sort of monitor local events, to monitor local elections, just to make sure that Hong Kong is a governable city. And then sort of from 2005, 2005, Chief Executive Tong Chee-hwa sort of was deposed by the Chinese because he was just proven to be so ineffective. And so he claimed that he had a bad knee, and so he sort of resigned. And then we had a new chief executive, Donald Tsang, who was fine, well, not really fine, but he didn't do much, and so it was sort of a peaceful time for Hong Kong until fast forward to 2012, which was another watershed moment for Hong Kong for two reasons. Number one, we have C.Y. Leung, which is the current highly unpopular chief executive, rumored and really commonly known to be a closet communist, running Hong Kong. And then at the same time, we have the once-in-a-decade leadership change in Hong Kong, where we have Xi Jinping coming to power. Now, if the nickname we have for C.Y. Leung is that he's a wolf, that he's ruthless, right? And so we call him the wolf. And then if C.Y. Leung is the wolf, then Xi Jinping would be the tiger in panda's clothing, if you will. Like, he looks very sort of benevolent, sort of chubby, good head of hair, but really he's sort of this fierce tiger who is purging his opponents. And as we have seen, what happened to Bo Xilai and what happened to sort of a lot of his political rivals. And so that's 2012, and that is a very, very pivotal year for Hong Kong. Ever since then, we see a rapid erosion of press freedom and freedom of expressions in Hong Kong. Incidents such as the Ming Pao editor-in-chief Kevin Lau being assassinated. He was stabbed 9 times or 7 times in broad daylight outside his home. And Apple Daily being the very vocal anti-establishment newspaper. The offices were repeatedly firebombed. And then Hong Kong University Vice-Chancellor appointment was interfered by the government. Hong Kong Television application for a license was rejected by the government for no good reason. There was a national curriculum, the patriotic curriculum saga in 2012, which produced such local hero as Joshua Wong. He was back then the 14-year-old who led hundreds of thousands of citizens in a street protest in order to get the government to back down and not introduce this patriotic propaganda education curriculum in all secondary schools in Hong Kong. And so that dovetailed really well to sort of where we are today. More recently, everybody knows that we have the disappearances of the 5 booksellers. One of them was sort of abducted while he was in his vacation home in Pattaya, Thailand. And so that is actually a very interesting question that I have for my fellow panelists, that sort of what was the Chinese-Thai customs or immigration arrangement that would allow Chinese law enforcement to come to Thailand to take a Hong Kong citizen away. Okay, so we have that, and then recently we have the ICAC appointment. ICAC is the Anti-Corruption Commission in Hong Kong, supposed to be independent from the government. It was investigating C.Y. Leung's sort of undeclared payments from an Australian engineering company, but the chief investigator was sort of removed from office, and so people thought that once again the government was trying to interfere in sort of all aspects of society. And then most recently we had the parliamentary election where certain pro-independence candidates were banned from running for office because they refused to sign a declaration the government made up to have them declare sort of unflinching loyalty to Beijing by accepting Hong Kong is an inalienable part of China. Okay, so that's sort of where we are. All that culminated in the umbrella movement of 2014, when tens of thousands of students and supporters camped out on the streets for 79 days. And I was very intimately a part of that movement. And as Jerome mentioned, I wrote a book about it. And to date, it remains the only English language book written about the movement, which really speaks to sort of the level of oppression, if you will, in Hong Kong, in that everybody applying for funding from universities to write a book about the movement have met tremendous opposition and obstacles. And the interesting thing that came out of the umbrella movement, if you will, that seems to be the popular name outside of Hong Kong, is twofold. Number one, universal suffrage as a political topic in Hong Kong is dead. Right, no one is going to bring that up again, at least for the foreseeable future, and that's a very sad chapter for Hong Kong. And number two, the radicalization of the opposition, and that's inevitable because the opposition felt that we have gone so far as to stage this historic 79-day occupation movement in Hong Kong, and still we fail to achieve any political gains. What more can we do? And sort of that kind of frustration and despondence spawned or fuel the radicalization. And so we have sort of this growing localism, growing pro-independence movement happening in Hong Kong. And that's why last week when we had the parliamentary election, we had 6 new lawmakers or 6 candidates voted into our parliament, which we call the LegCo, and most of them are sort of quite far right on the political spectrum, as in they are quite radical in their rhetoric, and I do emphasize the rhetoric because so far it has been sort of not much action, but merely talk, because frankly speaking, it's very hard to have a plan for pro-independence. Or for independence, because as you know, Hong Kong is such an integral part of China. We get, I think, 70% of our electricity from China, not to mention food and water. It's just a very sort of long shot pipe dream to declare Hong Kong a independent city-state. But anyway, so where does that leave us? So the umbrella movement of 2014 and then the LegCo election last week with the huge success for this sort of a new crop of politicians, I think speak to, in my opinion anyway, the complete mismanagement of Hong Kong by Beijing and the complete miscalculation. A lot of people are commenting that the independence movement is purely Beijing's own doing. In fact, 2 years ago, if you asked a person off the street in Hong Kong, what do you think about Hong Kong being an independent state, they would just laugh at you and just sort of walk away. But today, if you ask the same person the same question, that person will say, well, let me think about it, right? And people feel that in part, Beijing is to blame because of its tightening the grip. It's because of sort of Xi Jinping's increasing meddling in local affairs, or well, maybe not himself personally, but the leadership anyway, or the apparatus that he delegated to in Hong Kong. And to quote a line from one of my favorite recent movies is Captain America, Civil War. I do like a superheroes movie. There was a line when, the scene is when the Avengers were sort of split into 2 camps. One camp wanted the United Nations to control the agenda of the Avengers and approve their action, and then the other camp think that they are independent of any organization and should be able to do whatever they want. And then people sort of commented, well, in the 6 years since Iron Man appeared, on television, we have more world-ending events than ever, right? And then so that's when Tony Stark, Iron Man's alter ego, commented that that the Avengers' very strength invites challenge. Invites challenge. And challenge incites conflict. And conflict breeds catastrophe. What that means is that the more one side of the power grows, the more the other side will grow to match it. That's just a natural order of life. That's the natural order of biology. That's the natural order of politics. And the tighter Beijing, the grips Hong Kong, the tighter the reaction is. And that's why you have this sort of reactionary localism popping up. And I was commenting earlier that we are starting a local PEN chapter in Hong Kong. PEN International is sort of a literary group that promotes freedom of expression. And I'm part of that effort. If it weren't for the disappearances of the booksellers, we wouldn't have really thought about starting a PEN chapter. And if it weren't for that incident, we wouldn't be doing it with such sense of urgency. And so now we're seeing a lot of organizations popping up like Hong Kong, in Hong Kong, like PEN Hong Kong, in order to sort of make sure that we counter whatever encroachment Beijing is doing in Hong Kong. So the more they up the ante, the more that the Hong Kong population is willing to sort of see the bet and raise the bet. And so that sort of takes me to the next steps. I guess now that we have new localists and new radical lawmakers in our parliament in LegCo, we're expecting a lot more fireworks. The parliamentary session is supposed to start October 12, and so we're expecting a lot of hostility and standoffs between the government and lawmakers. And the million-dollar question is, can the opposition group organize themselves to somehow agree among themselves? And as for the lesson for Beijing is that maybe after years of escalation, maybe it should try something else. Try de-escalation, right? And see if you get sort of the same kind of de-escalation from the other side. And the best way of de-escalating in Hong Kong is, number one, to get rid of CY Leung and to put someone who is much more palatable to take his place. And number two is to get rid of the liaison office, which is sort of a big problem or big source of tension in Hong Kong. And there's every sign that CY Leung might not get re-elected, and the liaison office might not see, another session next year, because recently Sing Bao Daily, which is the pro-Beijing mouthpiece in Hong Kong, published sort of back-to-back sort of front-page attacks on CY Leung. And that's very rare for a pro-Beijing newspaper to do. Most people think that the only people the only reason why the newspaper would have the guts to do that is because it has Xi Jinping's backing, and so it is very possible that we might not see CY Leung in the government house come 2017. So I will pause there. I apologize if I go over the time, and then pass it to Benjamin.
Jason, thanks very much for that. Benjamin, I guess what Jason's looking at is the sort of significant changes that have gone on in China's back on its own doorstep and basically essentially part of its own territory. You've been looking at changes more regionally, but particularly with Thailand's relationship with China. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you've been discovering?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Hello? Yeah. Yes, okay. Thanks very much. And just to echo Jason's sentiments about the honor of being on the panel. Jason I've just met, but Kuhn Korpsak was one of the 77 people I interviewed for the book of mine that's forthcoming. My forthcoming book is called Thailand, Shifting Ground Between the U.S. and a Rising China. And as the title suggests, my overall premise is that a geopolitical shift has been and continues to be taking place within Thailand, whereby Thailand is moving away from the United States sphere of influence and into the sphere of influence of China. Certainly by employing the term sphere of influence, I'm essentially borrowing a Cold War term, and that is not by accident. Another premise of the book essentially is that with the Cold War having ended in the late 1980s, early 1990s, that terminology, sphere of influence, essentially became applicable again roughly 10 years later, with the exception of the 1990s, what's sometimes called the Pax Americana, when the United States was the only really global power. Beginning at the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century, the notion of spheres of influence became very much relevant again, and is certainly, I think, consistent with the point of view of the Chinese and of China's foreign policy. It happens, unfortunately, to be very inconsistent with the United States' view of this part of the world. And essentially, when you talk about spheres of influence and you talk about Cold War terminology being applicable today, another element of that is the zero-sum dynamic that pervaded the Cold War, right? Every gain, essentially, for the United States was seen as coming at the expense of the Soviet Union. And I would argue, again, starting at the beginning of this century, the same zero-sum dynamic pertains to the U.S.-China relationship. And again, certainly in this part of the world, in which the gains that I'll be describing this evening that have come for China have not only come for China across the board, but have come at the expense of the United States. Thailand is often referred to, and its foreign policy is often referred to as being bamboo diplomacy, right? Its ability to sway like a bamboo tree from one particular camp to another particular camp, from position to position, sort of based on the prevailing political winds. And however fair that might be, what I think that sometimes hides is how long Thailand often stays on one side or another before it decides to sway in a different direction. And there's a perspective issue here as well, because really from the late 1940s to the end of the century, if my argument pertains, Thailand was very much in the camp of the United States. For essentially a 50-year period, it was in the camp of the United States. And on the other side of that was the Chinese, right? The U.S.'s war on communism in this part of the world, at least initially, meant China on the other side of that equation. To the Chinese, of course, 40 or 50 years is minuscule. In the grand scheme of their grand and illustrious history, 40 or 50 years in which Thailand is sort of gone in another direction is insignificant, and they're reaping the rewards of playing a much longer game geopolitically than I think the United States is capable of playing. In the year 2000, former Prime Minister Chuan Leekpai, one of the last things he did in office was to sign something called the Sino-Thai Plan of Action for the 21st Century. I mention that because it was the first of what has become an almost annual, if not every 2 or 3 year event, whereby the Chinese and the Thais have signed a lengthy, comprehensive, rather highfalutin strategic document cutting across the board. And again, this is in contrast to what the United States has been doing during the same period. So if Thailand was very much in the United States camp for the latter half of the 20th century, it did begin to sway, as per its bamboo diplomacy, in the late 1990s, really starting with the financial crisis in 1997, when, aided and abetted greatly by the United States' politically heavy-handed and economically counterproductive response to that crisis, China pledged $1 billion. Keep in mind that $1 billion was exactly 1/17 of what the IMF determined was necessary to get the region out of its crisis. And moreover, China never actually gave that $1 billion. It simply pledged it. But in contrast to the United States policy, which was to not to contribute to the $17 billion bailout package and only to much later contribute to Thailand's recovery, China came out looking pretty well. So that's where the sway began. And eventually, the sway began to become an actual shift. And that really came in the form of a person by the name of Thaksin Shinawatra, who I'm guessing most of you have heard of. I will be confining my remarks tonight to the Thaksin administration, not for any particular reason other than I simply need to corral my research into something coherent and rather brief for tonight, but it's safe to say that what I say about the Thaksin administration pertains to the subsequent administrations as well. The trends I'll be identifying, the shift I'll be describing, began under Thaksin, partly because, of course, China itself, but also because of Thaksin's policies. But again, I can't emphasize enough that what I'm saying about Thaksin is as true, if not more true, of his successors, including his opponents, as it is of Thaksin himself. I interviewed Thaksin Shinawatra in London last year, in August of 2015, in what I described to him as my $1,200 conversation, because that's how much my plane ticket cost. After months of bargaining and arguing and negotiating an interview, I finally had to drop everything and fly to London for this interview. And I tried to joke with him as we started the interview that this conversation was costing $1,200, and I don't think he got the joke, given the size of his bank account. But it was a chunk of change for me. It did pay some dividends. When Thaksin came to power, China was growing at the rate of 8% a year. By the middle of his administration, China's growth was at 10, 12, and a whopping 13% by the end of his administration. Thaksin, as you know, was a businessman. Despite the fact that his political career began in 1994, he was first and foremost a businessman with a pre-existing economic relationship with China. So he came in, as he described himself, as a CEO premier with a first and foremost priority placed on his economic policies, and that meant hitching Thailand's wagon firmly to China, because with that kind of economic growth I just described, it made sense politically and economically to do so at a time when the United States was just suffering the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, and its priority began to shift significantly away, not only from this region to the Middle East, but frankly away from almost everything but for combating terror as it defined it. Thaksin was then, you could say, a contributor to this trend, to this meteoric rise of China, and to the shift that I'm describing, and not just a sort of observer or a witness. One thing that aided Thaksin in moving Thailand closer to China was the fact that his rise coincided not only with the rise of China itself, but with the completion of the rise of the Sino-Thai in Thailand domestically. Not to get into a long discussion about the history of the Sino-Thai, but it is to say that by the end of the 20th century, the Sino-Thai had emerged from, in fact, several years prior, had emerged from their almost exclusive economic, business, financial niche to become dominant across the board in Thailand. The politicians, even in the military. And that really, of course, Thaksin himself was Hakka, ethnic Hakka Chinese, was Thai Chinese himself, but he was not unique in that regard, and I think that's what helped him, was that suddenly he was part of a larger milieu that was able to draw upon his personal connections as well as draw upon a wider cultural acceptance and cultural celebration of what it meant to be Chinese at the time. You saw this not so much in the name of his political party, which was Thai Rak Thai, or Thais Love Thais, but you saw it in the slogan of the recently imprisoned Sondi Limthongkol, who would say on the streets of Thailand, Lukjin Rak Thai. In other words, sons and daughters of China love Thailand, essentially giving pride of place to China in that expression as opposed to Thailand itself. I don't mean to imply either that Thaksin was the only prime minister I interviewed. I interviewed 5 prime ministers, 7 foreign ministers on either side of the Thaksin administration, but again, need to simply confine my remarks to Thaksin on account of the shift that I'm describing as having begun under him. One main point is to say that the shift I'm describing really has taken place across the board. It's not merely an economic shift, even if that was Thaksin's primary priority. It has taken place economically, politically, diplomatically, and militarily in the past 15 years since Thaksin came to power and since the United States became extremely distracted and neglectful of this part of the region. And in an area that's rather specific to Thailand, China's growth vis-a-vis the palace, vis-a-vis the monarchy in Thailand, has far exceeded the relationship between the United States and the monarchy, which at one time was, of course, second to none in the world. I've already mentioned how the shift post-dates Thaksin, and I'll get to that more in a moment. And just to reemphasize that the picture I'm painting on the Thailand-China relationship is essentially the photo negative of the U.S.-Thai relationship. I can't, of course, with each point emphasize that or give an example, but you'll need to sort of take my word for it until the book comes out, that for every positive and productive step taken vis-a-vis the Thailand-China relationship, there was a non-step or a step back taken in the case of the United States and Thailand, and hence that zero-sum dynamic that I talked about, where one gain comes at the loss of someone else. Running through the factors relatively quickly, on the economic side of things, in 2003, Thailand and China signed a free trade agreement that was the first that China had signed with any Southeast Asian country. And again, although I won't be doing this throughout my remarks, the United States, for example, began talking about a free trade agreement with Thailand the year after, but those talks died and have never been resurrected in the year 2006. Before Thaksin was out of power, China had moved into second place behind Japan on Thailand's list of trading partners, which implies that it had long since moved ahead of the United States. And of course, by the time Yingluck came to power, Thaksin's sister, China would be the leading trading partner of Thailand. Thaksin's finance minister, whom he tellingly dubbed Mr. China, pledged to increase bilateral trade with China from $12 billion in 2004 to $50 billion by 2010. As ambitious as that sounded at the time, that was barely missed in 2010. It was missed by about $2 billion, and that was attributed to the fact that the U.S. had dragged the world into a financial crisis at the time, from which even the Chinese could not emerge unscathed. But it gives you some idea of the meteoric rise in the trade relationship between the two countries. The situation on foreign investment is even more impressive. When Thaksin came to power, China accounted for 1% of Thailand's foreign direct investment. 1%. In 2003, 2 years later, the Board of Investment set a goal for that year, for the year 2003, of increasing investment from China by 30%. By the end of the year, it had succeeded in increasing investment by 300%. So despite its best efforts at only increasing it 30%, it succeeded to the tune of 300%. Most impressive is that, again, under Yingluck in 2014, China would become Thailand's second largest source of foreign direct investment. So in 13 years, China went from accounting for 1% of foreign investment in Thailand to being its second largest source of foreign direct investment. And again, to harp on this, you can imagine the United States have dropped precipitously in terms of its rank on Thailand's list of key foreign investors. In terms of politics and diplomacy, Thaksin started something called the Chiang Mai Initiative, which I mention only because it was very much supported by China at a time in the wake of the financial crisis in 1997. It was designed as a bilateral currency swap for alleviating liquidity problems that had plagued the region in the context of that crisis. Again, China was a key supporter of that, and like his other policies, as I've said, it has since continued. In fact, under the Democrat Party, under Epicit Vejajiva's administration, that bilateral currency swap became multilateral, showing you the currency, if you will, of Thaksin's pro-China foreign policy. Although it had no effect on Myanmar, China also supported Thaksin's Bangkok process in trying to reform or in some way assist Myanmar in the early part of the 20th century in becoming a bit more palatable internationally. Despite the failure of that process, it's notable that China threw its weight behind it, given that China is normally rather reluctant to get involved, at least formally, in these sort of international processes. Something called the Irrawaddy Chao Phraya Mekong Economic Strategy, which, believe it or not, still exists, as per what I'm saying about the longevity of Thaksin's policies, was also supported by China. It was developed by Thaksin and supported by China as a means of facilitating and managing the economic opportunities that China was affording not only Thailand, but Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos as well. Thaksin's flagship diplomatic initiative was something called the Asian Cooperation Dialogue, which now consists of well over 30 countries. I think it's 35 or 36 countries. But interestingly, was never designed to include the United States. And when I asked Thaksin's foreign minister, Kun Sirakiart, as to why that is, he simply said, well, the United States is not part of Asia. And yet, it's been a part of ASEAN for decades. It participates in APEC. It eventually became part of the East Asia Summit. But it shows in some ways not only the pro-China nature of Thaksin's foreign policy, but the implicit and sometimes rather explicit opposite view vis-a-vis the United States. He had to be careful. Of course, during the War on Terror, it was very difficult to ignore U.S. overtures, but where he could, he often did. For example, he backed the Chinese view that the United States should be excluded from the East Asia Summit. The United States being what it is, it allowed itself to be excluded until 2010, even though it was invited to join by 2008. But that notwithstanding, the point is that Thaksin backed the Chinese in an effort to exclude the United States from a very, very large East Asian summit. Chinese President Hu Jintao and Thaksin respectively visited one another's country first upon becoming the heads of government in their two countries. I believe in every year Thaksin was in power that either President Bush visited Thailand or he visited Washington, he made a point of visiting China first. And Hu Jintao, by and large, did the same in Thailand as well. The early part of this century with Thaksin in power also marked a time in which China began to significantly upgrade its embassy in Bangkok in a trend that has continued to the present day. With the exception of one ambassador since then, all of their ambassadors have spoken fluent Thai. And in all cases, across the board, with no exceptions, have the numbers 2, 3, and 4 people in that embassy, typically in charge of being the deputy ambassador, as well as the heads of the political and economic sections, have all had fluency in Thai, which contrasts, of course, with the U.S. Embassy, with the exception of Ralph Boyce, Skip Boyce, who was ambassador here until early 2008. None of his successors have been fluent Thai speakers. None of his 3 successors have been fluent Thai speakers. China began sending significantly more cabinet members to Thailand. Former U.S. Ambassador Eric John once described to me that he said, look, their cabinet ministers are stacked like cordwood, and they'll be sent here to cut ribbons on new schools. I mean, it's a big deal when the U.S. sends its Secretary of, I don't know, Commerce, whose name I'm not sure of, maybe once every other year. But China sends cabinet ministers here on a regular basis, often for things that we in the United States wouldn't see as quite befitting cabinet ministers. It also began sending journalists to Thailand in much, much larger numbers. And mind you, most of these journalists are part of state-backed or state-supported media outlets. And it proved to be a real source of intelligence for the Chinese, and frankly, a real source of intelligence for the United States as well. I have the distinction, it might be impressive or it might be pathetic, of having read all 3,331 WikiLeaks cables and discovered to my surprise that Chinese journalists popped up a great deal in terms of the people that the embassy was meeting with and talking to and getting some intelligence on their Chinese counterparts. But the point is that China was sending these journalists to Thailand for that purpose as well. And finally, starting under Thaksin diplomatically and politically and continuing to the present day, there has been a proliferation, an absolute proliferation of Chinese language schools, Chinese associations, Confucian centers. Thailand holds more of those than any other country in Southeast Asia, and in fact holds more of those than all the other countries in Southeast Asia combined. The rise of Mandarin study in Thailand has taken off, and it's not only Mandarin, it's Chinese studies, it's Confucian centers. An interesting symbolic event happened in, I want to say 2002 or 2003, when the United States decided to give up its southern consulate in Songkhla province. The same building was then filled by the Chinese, and they have since made it their southern consulate in the south of Thailand, which I thought spoke symbolically to the shift that I'm describing. Militarily under Thaksin, China extended a $200 million credit to not only Thailand's army, but more importantly, Thailand's navy. And I'll refer to this later in terms of its importance. But $200 million in credit for the purchase of arms. It waived interest at the time. Thaksin's defense minister, Chavalit, in 2001, traveled to China to commence a bilateral defense dialogue that has never been missed since then. It was unprecedented in 2001, and in the past 15 years, it has not been missed. A great increase in the number of soldier students between the two countries took place under Thaksin and has continued to the present day. And this is notable, particularly in light of the fact that in the wake of the 2006 coup and the 2014 coup, the United States suspended all of that, all of those educational opportunities for Thai soldiers to study in the United States, which to me strikes one as cutting off one's nose to spite one's face. I mean, if you want to influence the Thai military in professionalism, human rights, the Geneva Conventions, etc., it seems to me that the last thing you want to do is stop them from studying at Fort Leavenworth and Fort Bragg, etc. But China sees an opportunity and saw an opportunity and increased those exchanges exponentially. In 2002, for the first time, Thaksin conceded to allow the Chinese to observe the Cobra Gold exercises, the seminal defense exercises that began in 1982 between the United States and Thailand and have since expanded to become basically regional. In fairness to the United States, that was not an unwise decision in 2002, given that China at the time was not what it is today. But, of course, by 2014, China had obtained Observer Plus status, which makes it privy to a lot more of those exercises than it used to be privy to, and in my mind is an enormous strategic blunder on the part of the United States. 2004, 5, and 6 also saw the first joint naval exercises between China and Thailand in the Andaman Sea, in the Gulf of Thailand, and also the first joint search and rescue operations between those two countries. And again, everything I've said has only continued and accelerated to the present day. And finally, the palace, the monarchy. I won't go into this too much, but it's symbolic that when President Hu Jintao visited Thailand in 2003, his welcome dinner was held in a royal palace. And this contrasts markedly to the United States, to President Bush's visits. He visited once in 2003 to join the APEC event. He visited again in 2008, and I'm making an exception to talking strictly about the Thaksin administration here. He visited again in 2008, but refused to travel from Bangkok to Hua Hin, where His Majesty the King was at his seaside palace. The justification given by the embassy was that Air Force One couldn't land safely and securely at the airport in Hua Hin, which was pretty rich, considering the fact that the United States built 7 airstrips for the country during the 1950s and 60s, and that the distance between Bangkok and Hua Hin is the equivalent of the distance between Washington and Philadelphia, which is a trip that the U.S. president makes as a matter of course. So that gives you some idea about the symbolism and the degree to which the Chinese have cultivated contacts and relations within the palace in a way that the United States has not done. In 2004, Princess Sirendorn, who's well known to have traveled many, many times to China. She travels there almost every year, including 2 weeks during her birthday in April. She was named the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries ambassador in 2004. And later in the decade was voted on the internet in China as China's second favorite foreign person. I don't know who was first, except that it was not the Dalai Lama. But it was a pretty high honor, given, but not entirely surprising, given that she's a fluent Mandarin speaker. She writes Chinese calligraphy fluently, and she's not the only one. Princess Chulaborn, one of her sisters, has been a more frequent traveler to China as well. Interesting as well that Chinatown, starting under Thaksin, but again continuing after Thaksin, has celebrated a lot of the royal holidays here in a way that it never did in the 20th century. If you go to Yaowarat Road on the King's birthday or the Queen's birthday, oftentimes with the Chinese ambassador present, they'll celebrate the royal holidays here in a way, again, that they didn't used to do, and certainly contrasts with what the Americans are not doing. I need to be brief, but look, there were 2 things that really inspired the writing of this book, for lack of a better word. 2 questions that I asked myself before undertaking the research. And I basically dealt with these facts throughout the book and eventually drew conclusions on them toward the end of the book. And those 2 questions were, first, why does this shift matter domestically in Thailand? What does it mean domestically in Thailand that Thailand is moving so far out of the sphere of influence of the United States and into that of the Chinese? And secondly, what are the international geopolitical implications of this shift? Okay, so what are the punchlines, if you will? Domestically, the punchline is that what all governments in Thailand have shared since Thaksin came to power is essentially an adherence to what I call the China model. the model of an authoritarian government backed by and backing a neoliberal market-based economy. Thaksin is well known for being authoritarian. In fact, I started my interview with him in an attempt to sort of set the tone by saying, with respect, former Prime Minister, I do refer to your human rights record in Thailand as the worst since Sarit in 1957 to 1963. He was completely nonplussed. He essentially said, I let that ship sail long ago. Human rights was never a priority for me. If you want to talk about foreign policy, we can, and we can certainly talk about human rights, but he had no problem, in other words, with my taking him to task on human rights. But again, it's not that Thailand looks like China. Thailand is Praetorian, right? For the overwhelming majority of years since 1932, Thailand has been run by the military, either expressly as it is today, or in some cases by proxy or by representative, as, for example, when Prem was prime minister in the 1980s. But it's a very Praetorian country in contrast to China, where the Communist Party reigns supreme and the PLA is a distant second. But in terms of its approach to governance and its approach to the economy, the China model has become attractive in Thailand and has really taken root. And I think the most important part of that is that may have begun under Thaksin. But despite the rhetoric of his opponents, and I'm thinking mostly of Sarayud, who came after Thaksin, and of Abhisit, who came several prime ministers later, that authoritarianism has been existing across the board, across the color-coded political spectrum in Thailand. And what does it mean? Well, it means that the human rights situation in Thailand has dropped precipitously in the past 14 or 15 years. It may have been the worst under Thaksin, but it was not markedly better under Thaksin's successors. In a number of areas, China was outright influential in Thailand on human rights. For example, the One China policy was a policy that Thaksin and his foreign minister adhered to without fail, strictly speaking. And it's a policy to which all of Thaksin's successors have adhered without fail. And this contrasts, mind you, to Chuan Likpai, for example, who was twice prime minister in the 1990s and who thumbed his nose at the One China policy. But Thaksin saw where his bread was being buttered, as have all of his successors, and have adhered strictly to the One China policy. Thaksin sent back a number of Uyghurs to China at a time when the Uyghurs were just starting to find their voice, as well as attract some attention in the wake of the September 11 terrorist attacks. The Uyghurs have become much more famous in recent years. General Prayuth repatriated about 100 of them at the beginning of 2015. They were implicated potentially in the bombing of the Erawan Shrine last year. I don't think that's ever been proven, but this was at a time under Thaksin at least when the Uyghurs were not terribly well known. Thaksin did not allow the Dalai Lama to visit the country, which again was in contrast to his predecessors. China and the United States were often involved in a tug of war in Thailand for Chinese dissidents, political dissidents. China wanted them back, the United States wanted them protected and or resettled. And I should say, in fairness to the US, most of the time under Thaksin, the United States was successful. In subsequent years, that has been the reverse. China has been more successful in winning that tug of war for the repatriation of its dissidents. And the Falun Gong movement. I don't know if anyone remembers the Falun Gong. They're still in existence. But in the early part of the 21st century, the Falun Gong were a late 20th century, really, were a sort of religious sect that grew up in China and was seen, as most things are, by the Chinese government as being somehow a threat to national security. Thaksin said to me, and he proved to be correct, that he never sent back to China any of the Falun Gong, but he made it very clear they were not to practice in Thailand. And although some did under his nose, anytime the Chinese asked for them to be taken off the street or to be just sort of quietly tucked away, he abided by that. It also has democratic implications, right? Not only democracy, not only human rights, but democracy. When you talk about the China model, you talk about authoritarianism, and I need not go on for very long in terms of the effects of the China model on Thailand's democratic growth over the past 15 years. Whether you're looking at the actual governments themselves and their models of governance, or whether you're looking at the PAD, the UDD, the PDRC, all of which have a D in their names, but none of which, with some minor exception, have adhered to anything resembling democracy. Never mind American democracy or Western democracy, or even a Thai-style democracy. So what you have is a delegitimization, if you will, of democracy in Thailand at a time when China is rising and when democracy is being used rhetorically at sort of at an all-time high rate. And finally, and I'll close here, is the geopolitical implications of this shift. Why does this shift matter geopolitically? Well, the South China Sea, as everyone is recently aware, is becoming extremely hot. In 2001, there was a mid-air collision between a U.S. signals intelligence airplane and a Chinese interceptor fighter. It resulted in the death of a number of Chinese air pilots, and it created great consternation between China and the United States in 2001. Thaksin was, frankly, unusually neutral in that dispute, which was interpreted rightly by both China and the United States as being essentially pro-China, because in years past, an incident like that would have resulted in a condemnatory statement by Thai officials. But in this case, Thaksin tried to sort of have it both ways by being neutral, and it really upset the Americans, and I think it sent the right signal, as far as Thaksin was concerned, to China, that it would be taking a much more objective view and neutral view of the South China Sea. And that is a position that Thailand has tried to maintain since then. One interlocutor I interviewed for the book said to me that Thailand has essentially tried to be a mediator in the South China Sea so as to avoid having to take a side at all, going so far as to extend its formal mediation role into an informal role so as, again, to avoid having to take a side. To me, much more important, frankly, and much more interesting than the South China Sea is the Isthmus of Kra. The Isthmus of Kra is the narrow 100-kilometer body of land that separates the Gulf of Thailand on the east and the Andaman Sea on the west. China, as is well known, has been seeking for years an outlet to the Andaman Sea on the west, an outlet that would afford it the opportunity to bypass the Malacca Straits. The Malacca Straits are critical to the Chinese because they're basically controlled by the United States 7th Fleet. So over the years, and this is why China has been making inroads into Bangladesh and into Myanmar, it's been looking for an alternate means of reaching the Andaman Sea. In 1972, the U.S. engineers were commissioned by the Thai government to look into the possibility of building a canal across the Isthmus of Kra. Nothing became of that, but that happened in 1972. The Japanese were extremely interested in 1985 at the height of their economic rise. Thaksin himself, and what is often forgotten, was Chuan Likpai's foreign minister for about 3 months in 1994, at a time when Chuan was building a land bridge that has never been completed, by the way, but it's called Highway 44, and it's a road from the Gulf of Thailand to the Andaman Sea. How much that might have influenced Thaksin is difficult to say, as he was foreign minister at the time, but he was assigned then, in 1997, by Prime Minister Shawalit, the task of trying to get this canal built. He was deputy prime minister to Shawalit in 1997. Thaksin told me that he was unsuccessful in 97. He said institutions and individuals more powerful than he basically vetoed the idea. But it never really died. Thaksin revisited it in 2003. He commissioned a report that released, set up a committee that released a report in 2005. And I argue in the book that the roads and the railways that we have seen in the wake of Thaksin's administration essentially are designed as auxiliary projects to a canal that will eventually be built. And it will be built because of China's insatiable desire to get to the Andaman Sea and to do so in a way that will allow it to bypass the Malacca Straits in the event of a conflict, likely by proxy, with the United States, likely over something in the South China Sea. I conclude the book, and I'll conclude here just by saying that I spend time assessing whether and when that canal will be built, coming down, as I say, on the side of it being built sooner than later. Thank you.
Benjamin, thanks very much for that. Kopsak, can I maybe go to you on part of that? Often when you speak to US and Chinese officials here publicly, they often say there's no either or. Thailand doesn't have to choose between the US and China. It can go its own way. Do you see that a full-on sway or pivot has happened in Thailand to China. And more regionally, I mean, do regional neighbours have to now pick a side, pick a sphere of influence, or can they find a middle way?
Thanks, Well, I don't think I can add much more than what Ben's research has highlighted and illustrated. On choosing sides, the bamboo bending with the wind, yes, that's the typical Thai way of getting by, managing, muddling through. Not choosing sides is something I think is in the DNA of Southeast Asians, of how to get by. But there we see now some Southeast Asians are choosing sides for a variety of factors. The most clear-cut is Cambodia, of course. A Cambodian senior official once even said in a closed-door seminar, he said, well, Cambodia, we have two threats to our existence. One is Vietnam, one is Thailand. Who can guarantee our existence? Is it ASEAN or is it China? Therefore, when we have to make a choice between China and ASEAN, we choose China. So that was quite open of them to have to say that. In terms of the Thai bamboo kind of swaying with the wind, it presupposes, of course, that people can see which way the wind is blowing, or which is something it's not to be looked down upon, because a lot of people would like to know that. Sometimes when we don't really know, there's a story, I don't know how true it was. In 1949, a former dictator, General Pibun Songkram, Marshal Pibun Songkram, I think, in 1949, he changed that on his own, just by his own, no referendum, no nothing, Brexit or anything. Said, well, Siam should be called Thailand, which proved prescient because when the Japanese invaded and looking for Siam, the people said, no, there's no Siam here, it's further down south. And then the Japanese went over and conquered Singapore. So there was a bit of prescience and good luck, a typical Thai way of getting by. And of course, after the Second World War, Siam was never a party to the conflict and was never seen as having been an Axis ally of Japan. But yes, I think, Jerome, that the broad trends that Ben has outlined is quite true. For China is the big boy in the block now, the richest person, something that Thais value, certainly. Richness, size, and all of it, I think, is a matter of scale also. It's unprecedented. It's something I think that we don't really fully realize either in this region, historically, in the past. We have to now look, I think, have to conclude that what we are facing is not only the rise of China, that's gone. They have risen. There's a date, I'm telling, well, because I probably won't be around, but I'm telling my children and grandchildren to look out for 2049, 33 years from now. 2049, many things happening in that year. One of it is Thailand will be, because of the rotating nature of ASEAN chairmanship, Thailand will be chairman of ASEAN. Nobody would notice that. It's not important. Nobody's going to report that. But 2049 is also the 100-year anniversary of the Communist Party of China's rule of China. Xi Jinping has been saying 100 years of shame, of being kicked around by the West is over. But quietly, I don't know, when I speak to my Chinese colleagues, I pick up somehow that the other important 100-year mark is the 100 years of Chinese Communist Party rule of China. Will they then be able to announce that we are not only number one economically, we're number one in all areas, sea, air, land, military, economic? How do they see that? And what kind of future they would like to have for this region? Are we going back to the tributary system in the past 200-300 years ago, before the 100 year of humiliation of shame? Mandala states where borders are not fixed, but very shifting coalitions, people but sending tributaries to the Middle Kingdom, producing exotic things for some foreign markets, but basically trading commerce with the Middle Kingdom only. So perhaps is that the future we're looking at in the next 20, 30, 40 years? So I was a bit saddened perhaps in a certain sense that we're not going to see 1.3 billion Jasons. That's a shame. Can you imagine if there are 1.3 billion more Jasons around in the world and being able to speak to us, to think in this way? But in terms of what Ben was saying, there are maybe two or three caveats I had talked to him about. That if you take a poll of Thais, do another referendum, what kind of lifestyle they would like to have? Is it an American Western lifestyle, or is it a Chinese lifestyle? Overwhelmingly, I'm sure, even though there are a lot of Sino-Thais and all that, they know the importance of the economic of China. They take some pride in the rise of China, take some pride in the China standing up to the world, in the world, as an Asian. But I think overwhelmingly they would say, look, we're on Facebook. I have a Facebook, page. I like the American way of life, the Western lifestyle. I don't mind the fast food. I don't, I like watching movies, from Hollywood and all the TV shows. So that is still to be worked out. The kind of popular preference, apart from the elite defining what is in the national interest or what is in the group interest, the elite interest, which country, where the wind blows. Secondly, I'm not sure whether the military has been fully taken over. I'm sure the military knows that, yes, why not some military hardware from China, and we don't like the Americans telling us off, intruding, US is not our father, sort of taken from a Thaksin quote about the UN. But although there's a strong kind of coordination, cooperation now increasingly with the military of China, I'm not sure whether that is really deep down what these military types with their uniform, which is almost indistinguishable from the uniforms they saw in Kansas, Fort Worth, or Leavenworth, or what they had gone through at West Point, whether that is really their preference. So those two things, I think, are still there to be worked on, to be seen how the flow of things are. But certainly the influence, the lessons of Hong Kong may be telling. When Jason asked how was the umbrella, the events, the movement reported in Thailand, I think we would have to say, as initially Jerome saying, there are many movements, but in Thailand. But even for Hong Kong, I think that went by without much attention in Thailand as a whole. Even though there was a lot of opportunity there to jump on it, to say, look, democracy, they're standing up for democracy, they're demonstrating in the streets. But I think even, at that time, maybe demonstration fatigue in Thailand, or no, another demonstration somewhere else, or why umbrellas? Is it raining or what? Is it too hot? It didn't go beyond the sort of perception of umbrellas on the streets. So I think in those terms, though, not the lifestyle terms, but in the governing terms, I think that democracy has taken a back seat. And as Ben was saying, this kind of a Beijing consensus model of authoritarian government that can deliver economic growth, that can keep basic order. Perhaps that argument is increasingly being won by China, even though because of proximity. But then the other lesson is when we look at how they will handle Hong Kong, contagion effect, of course, I think is a big concern of theirs. If they let Hong Kong, then other cities, other towns in China. But extrapolating from that, if that is what they think, well, then would they let a country in Southeast Asia also be different, have free press, expression, have open elections perhaps in the near neighborhood, in their sphere of influence, as a great power is entitled to have? Or as the US would always be trying to get democratic regimes in their near neighborhood. So I don't know whether countries like Thailand, we may be looking at existence perhaps like Canada, sort of a non-entity perhaps, without its own characteristics. Although, okay, they're very nice people. I mean, some of my best friends are Canadians, of course, but they do live in a kind of a shadow world under the huge shadow of the US. Is that what we're looking at for Asia now? And therefore, again, 33 years from now, I think that would be the answer. When the successor of Xi Jinping in 2049, big parade, Tiananmen Square, says 100 years of communist rule of China, and this is what we have achieved. Are they going to be number one in all spheres? Economic, ministry, social governance, peace and order, stability, investment, the open seas. Is the US going to do much to that, apart from having a few soldiers running around in the Darwin, Northern Australia bush, and then call it pivot? Well, or would they try to undermine that? Or would President Trump say, okay, why, fine, you take half the world, this is a sort of real estate kind of thing. You take the western half of the Hudson River, I take Manhattan, you go take New Jersey and everything else, to divide it up. So we have to look at that. And I'm sorry, I have a bit of cold, although Hillary Clinton might say, well, that's a seasonal allergy. But sitting here on the panel, I don't know whether, if I do faint, might be a sort of George H.W. Bush moment in Tokyo. But I think almost for the first time in a long time in my own life that I'm able, both U.S. presidential candidates are older than me. Well, I'm so glad about that. I've never seen that. But does it even kind of symbolically or sort of in terms of perspective, does indicate some kind of sort of relative, let's say, relative decline of China, of the U.S., although the Chinese leaders, of course, are not young themselves, but they still are told never to show white hair, of course. They have to, have dark hair, even, they have to be groomed. And of course, they still wear suits with a tie. And I always mention that. And again, going back to this date, which I like to put out there, 2049. Watch if the president of China gets up there, Tiananmen Square, whether he wears a suit or goes back to the Chinese Mao dress, the Mao suit. Then we're going to have that big shift, tectonic shift in the world. And I think that is what the countries in this region are looking at, whether they know it or not, but consciously or not. But they can feel it. They can sort of. We are always reactive. They can sense the direction of the wind, how strong it is, and all that, and try to adapt accordingly. But I would have to say that yes, this is something. That as Jerome said, we have to look much more carefully, because it's not only our future, our children's, our grandchildren's future, of how we're going to live in this part of the world, and therefore also in other parts of the world, as a risen China would have to now to find its place in the world. One more last story that. In another, because I attend these kind of think tank forums where everybody says it's Chatham House rules, nobody has to quote, you can't quote me and this and that, which makes people say things that they wouldn't otherwise say, and then they get quoted by people like me telling you stories of what they said. So one Chinese person was saying, US, the US, they used to be Rome. Political, economic, social, military, all powerful. But 10, 20 years ago, they became Athens. Only cultural, soft power, Hollywood only, music. And now, they are only Sparta. Only military might. So some of the Chinese might be saying that the only challenge they face now is a military one of catching up. So they're not going to force confrontation 20, 30 years, because they know they cannot win militarily. But 30, 40 years from now, again, that big question. And again, a question for Hong Kong. How would you answer like a Cambodian would? Who is the threat to your way of life, status quo, and who is going to come and protect you and fight for you? If the answer is perhaps no one, not even the US, then it means, my God, we all have to adapt, we all have to change, and we all have to try to live with the new order.
Thank you very much. Well, look, the microphone's up there. Let's open the floor up to questions from the audience. I guess I'll just ask a question very quickly, but Kopsak mentioned 2049. Strikes me that 2 years before that is the moment Hong Kong will become, if I'm right,
yes.
Correct me if I'm wrong on that,
yes.
Yeah, Hong Kong will become no longer a semi-autonomous region. It will be part of China.
Right, so the year 2047 is the year when the basic law expires, and so the one country, two systems is supposed to be over and sort of to be continued and to be negotiated, just like the British and the Chinese negotiated the fate of Hong Kong back in the 70s and the 80s. And then the year 2049 is the year when Macau, which is the other European colony, will have their 50-year one country, two system policy expiring. It's interesting that Kopsak mentioned the year 2049, looking so far ahead, that's 33 years later. In Hong Kong, we don't think that far ahead, not only because people are sort of very preoccupied with what's happening at the moment. They have to pay their mortgage, and it's a very sort of competitive city, and it's a very expensive city to live in. But also because we don't have answers for life beyond 2047, and so we're so afraid to think about it, and so we just sort of bury our head in the sand. And then there is sort of a third response to the year 2047, which is that we don't think the Communist Party will last that long. And maybe that's a bit of sort of a wishful thinking, but that's nonetheless what a lot of people, myself included, believe. 30 years later, we're talking about 3 leadership changes. Already we're seeing a lot of cracks in the leadership in Beijing. We're seeing increasingly intense, if not public, factional infighting in Beijing, so public that it's playing out sort of on the world platform, a world stage for everybody to see. And the economy is spinning out of control. Plus, it's running on this idea that by making people wealthy, they will care less about things like freedom of expression or the civil liberties, which is a self-defeating, in my opinion anyway, a self-defeating approach. Because as people get more educated, as people travel more, as people get access to more information, they're bound to demand more. So, I really don't buy this idea you can numb people economically. So I hope that I and my fellow believers that we will outlive the Communist Party, and that by 2047 we'll be looking at a new world order in Asia, that we don't have to deal with that magical date.
Dominic.
Yes, I was very intrigued by your reference to the Kra Canal. I've never heard anybody predict so definitively that it would be built, particularly as one of the main objectives would be to shift energy from the Middle East to China, which obviously needs it because it's resource-starved. And you have pipelines going through Burma, which should reduce that. So I'd like to hear a bit more about that, and I'd also like to hear from Kobsak about what he thinks on that particular score, being an expert on world trade. As I say, I've never heard anybody be so definitive on it. This is the world's oldest infrastructure project. It goes back to the 16th century. It gets revived every 10 or 15 years, and it never happens. So it'd be fascinating if it is about to happen.
Yeah, I don't want to say, hello?
I think it's working.
It's working? I don't want to say, I guess, too much out of the interest of sort of scooping myself and scooping the book, but essentially I feel that the argument is that China is going to need that canal in a way that it doesn't yet. For the time being, the Malacca Straits are okay. They're sufficient. They may be well controlled by the 7th Fleet, but as yet, the 7th Fleet is unchallenged, and it cannot be challenged. It's not just that China is not trying to pose a challenge, but it doesn't have the wherewithal yet. It has one aircraft carrier, for example. But at some point, and this is sort of taking Kuhn Korpsak's long view, although I don't think it'll be 33 years before the commencement of this canal begins, or before the canal begins to be built, that the equation will shift. Basically, China is going to find itself in increasing trouble within ASEAN vis-a-vis the South China Sea. Taiwan is going to continue to rear its inconvenient head in China. Never mind Macau and Hong Kong, that are probably too geographically removed, and Tibet at the moment too geographically removed to require this. But I think as a defense, largely as a defense mechanism, it's not just oil and resources. That's often what's cited when the Malacca Straits are cited. 80% of China's oil and liquefied natural gas goes through the straits. So it's clearly dependent upon those straits, and it clearly has no control. Never mind piracy. If the United States wanted to shut it off, it could, and prevent China from getting that energy. It's one of the reasons China is so interested in the South China Sea, because of the potential oil and natural gas deposits in that part of the world that would allow them to ignore what's west of the peninsula anyway. But China's approach has always been to win without fighting, as opposed to fight in order to win, right? It's the mirror negative of the American approach to geopolitical expansion. And I think as largely as a defensive measure, sooner than later, before it gets to be too obviously connected to a conflict or too obviously connected to its energy needs, it will seek to do that, and it will do so largely through financial means. You know, at the end of the day, one of the reasons it was discontinued or has never gained traction in Thailand, several reasons. One is that it would cut the country in half, right? It would literally physically cut the country in half. And this was a concern even in the late 90s, before the insurgency in the Deep South began to reignite in 2004. So there was concern about just the psychological effect on Thai people having the country cut in half, and their environmental concerns. It's a 2-degree difference in terms of the water temperature of the Gulf of Thailand and the Andaman Sea. So the fish stocks, it would cause, I'm not a scientist, so I can't go into great detail, but I'm told that fish stocks, not to mention livelihoods of people on either side of that peninsula, would be grossly affected by that. And those are the two things that have harmed or hindered the development of this plan thus far. But given the seminal shifts that are underway in this part of the world, including in this country, I would not discount a shift in priorities as to what Thailand wants and what Thailand needs. And those will be largely dictated, I think, by what China needs, in a way that the United States was able to come in, granted a half century ago, and say we need 7 air bases here in order to carry out our grand geopolitical plan, which was namely to defeat the communists in the region. The specifics of the game may have changed, but I do think that that strategy continues to pertain, and I think that canal is central to it.
Yes, I think so. A few factors why that idea, basically it's associated with General Chaudhry, of course. So any idea associated with General Chaudhry immediately raises doubts and what is he thinking about? Is this serious? But anyway, so wherever he got it from, I think it was a serious kind of look economically for Thailand, developmental-wise, and sort of a bit of annoyance at times with Singapore, the tail wagging the ASEAN dog, and Thailand being also part of ASEAN and all that. It never got off the ground, basically, for a variety of reasons, because Chaudhry was not in power that long. Secondly, in terms of how much traffic would be diverted from Singapore and how much traffic would go through the canal. At that time, Singapore had built itself up as a bunkering port. Ships had to stop there for many reasons, and also as an entrepot. So whether a canal would then challenge that kind of traffic through the Malacca Strait in Singapore or not, in terms of international trade. And China wasn't that big a consumer at that time. But as Ben says, it has shifted. The economic factors perhaps has shifted now that, yes, congestion in the Malacca Straits, uncertainties in the South China Sea, maybe makes a canal viable now in terms of engineering knowledge now. Perhaps could be easier to do that in terms of the fish stocks. Perhaps both sides of the water, there's almost no fish anymore. We won't really hurt any of the fish there. But a very interesting one, but perhaps, I don't know how they're going to come down on this. There was an element, a faction in Thai politics that was saying that, the 3 southern provinces are too much trouble, just cut them off. They won't vote for us anyway, and therefore that concern of cutting the country down there physically in terms of perception into half, and then the southern half going off somehow, and being more away from the control of Bangkok. Somehow a lot of influential Thais could not wrap their minds around that to cut up the country in that sense. But now, if it's not only the three southernmost provinces are being affected and the violence moves up, especially to Hua Hin, whether that kind of thinking and logic would go the other way now and say, why, okay, we have a cutoff somewhere there. It may be more north of the three southern provinces than we want, but it's not going to reach up to Hua Hin. So those perhaps are the dynamics, but I would agree with Ben that perhaps the most important factor would be whether China really wants it, whether China would then come full court press to say to Thailand, please build this canal, we'll do it for you, we'll pay it, and we'll make sure that we will support any kind of form of government that you decide to have in your country to run your own affairs. And that would be the determining factor for whether this canal will come up.
Hi, Philip Showell. Jason, first of all, I was impressed by that you thought the Communist Party might not be with us within 3 decades, but more immediately, we had these amazing sort of scenes a week or so ago during the elections when Nathan Law particularly sort of triumphed and did so well, and various other candidates with him. What practical difference, I think you said Legco is going to sit again on October the 12th? Mm-hmm. Yeah. What practical difference does his election and the election of some of his like-minded souls actually mean? I mean, does that change the balance of power within Legco? And pardon me, I don't know how much influence Legco has when you have C.Y. Leung and the liaison office actually perhaps really running the show. So we had the headlines, we had the drama, we had this amazing story of this 23-year-old triumphing. But what practical impact will that have on the way Hong Kong is run and the political scene there?
Well, the answer is a little complicated because the way the Legco is designed, there are 2 magical numbers. One is 18 and the other one is 24. 24 is the minimum number of opposition lawmakers that you need to block bills that are related to constitutional reform or sort of the critical matters relating to the basic law. And so it was very important for the opposition side to have at least 24 seats. And they had that, and they well exceeded that. I mean, they were able to get 30 seats, 3 more than the previous Legco session. Right, so in terms of dynamic, so that's not going to change, right? Because they already have the blocking vote compared to the previous Legco session. What will change is the intensity of the filibusters, which is the only tool available to the opposition to vote down or force the government to withdraw their government proposed laws. And in the previous Legco session, the only opposition lawmakers who are willing to fully support filibustering are the likes of Longhair, Ray Chan, and there's maybe 2 or 3 of them. But now with the sort of pack of 6 new young lawmakers in Legco, the Lonely 3 is going to sort of grow into the alliance of 9. And so then that means in reality, on practical terms, they can take turns, they can take shifts in sort of delaying bills being voted and debated. And that would significantly increase the political cost for the government. And so we will definitely see that dynamic in the coming Legco. Apart from that, I guess just more colorful, more explosive fireworks. Members of Young Inspiration have already vowed that they're going to take over the Legco chairman seat, which is sort of in the middle, sort of occupy that seat. in order to paralyze the parliamentary session. So that's something that we haven't seen. Quite popular in Taiwan, for instance, but Hong Kong, we haven't seen that, so we might see that and things like that happening. So people are sort of watching the October opening session with great interest. And that is also going to set the tone for the rest of the parliamentary session in the coming 9 months. Because a lot of the young inspiration supporters are they voted these candidates in expecting to see that, and now they have to deliver. And so October 12 will be really very much a date to watch.
And they could have an immediate impact on October the 12th. There's events taking place in terms of parliamentary procedure that they could have a say on.
Well, the first session is just sort of taking the oath and swearing in, so it's going to be very logistical. I don't think any actual bills will be debated on that day, but their behavior, their attitude toward the electrical chairman, the facial expressions, what they bring into electrical, like 'cause a lot of people bring in props, what they bring into electrical will be very sort of indicative, very symbolic of the years to come.
Doug Sanders from Mahidol. Kopsak's comment about ties looking to the U.S. As the sort of image of the life they would like in a situation in which, in fact, it is this surge of China in the economy and the realities of Asia, struck me very much. We all sort of see Los Angeles all the time on television and in movies. I was in Beijing for a couple of conferences about a month ago. I was dazzled by Beijing. I hadn't been there for 10 years. My God, there is a flourishing bourgeois scene. The universities are large. There's lots of foreign students. There's a worldly elite who we were drinking champagne at a gala organized by the LGBT Center in one of the upscale hotels in Beijing, apparently an annual fundraiser. My point is the question as to whether China can emerge as an appealing image in the way that the U.S. has through its control of international media and its long elite bourgeois existence. Certainly, there are great aspects of Beijing and Shanghai which are quite dazzling. And the question as to whether the Communist Party will survive, I wonder if it has survived, actually, with the tremendous economic change in economic structure. And what kind of movies does China produce now? They produce these elaborate, expensive, boring, huge, historical dramas, which seem to have no political content whatsoever, except perhaps that the old leadership was pretty awful and killed thousands of people. But I mean, this is the same kind of mindless entertainment we get from Captain America and the Batman movies and the Superman movies and all of this kind of stuff. I mean, they are now producing mind-numbing, crap. Very, very well done and very colorful and thousands of cast members. I mean, China has changed so incredibly, but it has not yet, except for I think some, kind of emerged as a kind of how to put it? I haven't thought this through well. Emerged as a kind of being able to establish a lifestyle accessible to, of course, only a segment of the population, but which challenges, in fact, the hegemony of Europe and North America.
What do you think then, Benjamin, in that you've looked at, you talked a lot about the sort of geopolitical and what about cultural? I mean, what about, is China chic?
It's increasingly, yeah, I think it's increasingly chic in Thailand in one way, and I mentioned the proliferation of Mandarin language schools, of Chinese associations, and the number of Chinese students, for example, in Thailand, and the number of Thai students to China. I'm not talking about mill-to-mill relations at this point, but just on a cultural level. That has grown exponentially, and it does, the proof is in the pudding, if you will, in terms of the rise in those numbers. One point that I will make, and it's a point that Kuhn Korbsak made to me when I interviewed him about a year ago, which is to say that Thais do not look favorably on the influx of Chinese tourists in Thailand by and large. There are exceptions to that, of course. I was shocked, again, reading the WikiLeaks cables, to learn that the number of Chinese tourists to Thailand exceeded the number of American tourists as far back as 2008. And I assumed that they had crossed that line perhaps in the past year or two. But in fact, going as far back as 8 years from now, the number of Chinese tourists exceeded those of the United States. And in some ways, to answer your question, sir, the anecdote you began with in some ways presages your answer. You talked about you went to China and were amazed by what you saw there. But the degree to which China is able to influence the outside world and project an image that it wants to be a positive image is going to depend in large part not just on its movies but on its people. And again, thinking about Kuhn Korbsak's comment a year ago that I'm borrowing now, in many ways the Chinese, and I'm generalizing here, and I'm not being critical, but it's not unusual, it's not a secret to note that most Thais don't look favorably upon the mannerisms, the way in which a lot of Chinese tourists conduct themselves in Thailand. And that, you know, Americans have had a reputation for years for being loud, arrogant, and opinionated abroad because we're loud, arrogant, and opinionated abroad, right? Until and unless that changes, that will partly define our image abroad. And so I think it may be a different set of criteria you apply to the Chinese, but it's not just Hollywood versus the Beijing or the Shanghai movie set. It's going to be people-to-people relations. I think in that one limited area, China has yet to catch up to the Americans, or perhaps to Westerners, or to the other, if you will, broadly speaking.
Korbsak, what's your... He's stolen your ideas from a year ago.
Yes, it dates me a bit, but yes, but I think that's kind of attitude, perhaps a bit patronizing, of course, because I always tell Thais that, look, you know, what you say about the Chinese tourists, exactly what the Swiss say about Thai tourists in Switzerland. They don't line up, they don't, they don't order the right things. They have tomato sauce with their, whatever, fondue and all that. So, and they bring their own chili. But that is also, I think, the same attitude in Hong Kong. Well, in Singapore, Singaporeans say, we are not Chinese. Who are these guys coming from mainland China? We're not them, they're not us. So that kind of that sort of attitude, I think, is just being different, and again, in terms of scale, numbers. I think recently up north, they first banned Chinese from driving across the border because that was taking up too much of the road space and causing a lot of havoc up in the north. Now it's about 30 cars a day that they allow in. Perhaps it was 2,000 or 3,000 a day coming across in big, long caravans from China. But that could change. But looking at the broader picture, I don't want to leave, again, the impression that I think that 2049 is set, that that there'll be the president, the party chairman, going to announce that China now rules the world once again. But there are, of course, two other scenarios, at least there. The other extreme, of course, China breaking up, instability, provinces, cities, terrorism, Xinjiang, and other places, Tibet, problem, Taiwan breaking, Hong Kong. But that poses another set of problems. Instability, factionalism, strife, conflict, powers, even in the South China Sea, Southeast Asia, then we have to be careful that we don't want them fighting over Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asia becoming another Middle East, unending war, conflict. So perhaps even from the military, they would see that a stable China, whoever rules, is preferable to a destabilized China, however good that might be for perhaps a minimum human rights and individual rights. But in the middle could be a kind of coexistence between the two superpowers that we have now, how they work it out, how they manage, how they put the boundaries, peripheries, the guidelines of how they coexist in the world and how they influence countries, how they get along, how they tackle common problems. Climate change, for example, a good example, could be other things, perhaps North Korea, nuclear exchange, and all that. That would be good. That would be good, rather than zero sum, as Ben was saying, if they can do that, if they can work that out. The big if here, I would say, because China has that kind of continuity that perhaps at least in the short term would carry on and has been there for about 40, 50 years. As Ben was mentioning the role of Chinese ambassadors. The first Chinese I met when I went to China, sneaking in on with a sports delegation across into Canton, was Mr. Zhang Juiyuan. He, short guy, spoke impeccable Thai, better than any Thai. All the royal words, all from the poems and from the literature and everything. We couldn't understand him, although he was speaking Thai, because he was using words so elaborate and high. But this guy eventually became ambassador in Thailand. So after 40 years, that continuity of people who were engaged with Thais was there on the part of China. And they have a clear sense of what Thailand is. And I would say they don't really trust Thais because they know that we don't really keep our word. So they take that into account, that the Thais are not, really people to be trusted. So they spread their bets around the ASEAN countries. I think they feel that Cambodia they can really work with more. Quid pro quo. Okay, you do this, 600 million goes there. You do this, 100,000 rice, tons of rice will be bought, and they feel that that's good. But for us, I think we sometimes overestimate our value to China because then we say, why didn't you give us good interest rates for the railway line? Like the same level as Laos. But they say, you are richer. Well, why do you want more? Because that kind of special relationship is not really there for Thailand. I would feel we sometimes overestimate our value to China. But when they look down, they see not only Thailand but the whole range of countries. Now Myanmar being more and more brought into play and all that, and they see how things can change, how Duarte can rise, and then can flip-flop. I think you heard all this story about Duarte at the East Asian Summit in Vientiane. Usually, the big powers speak. East Asian Summit, ASEAN countries, Japan, China, Korea, US, Russia, and all that. East Asian Summit. But the president of the Philippines asked to speak first. And he said, I want to speak about human rights. Everybody, okay, fine. Good, well, the message is getting through. Human rights, he said, existed long ago, 100 years ago, because it was an issue during American colonialism. The Americans, and he had a big poster and photo, like, killed Moro people in Mindanao And that started the fight, the Islamic extremism 100 years ago, 1910, over 100 years ago. So complete flip-flop. And the Chinese Prime Minister was smiling. Oh, what, yeah. You know, he didn't have to do anything because the Philippines just sort of went over the other side. So that kind of thing happens. But just mentioning that, I think the other area, of course, that we're you know, when we talk about the role of China, superpower, U.S., of course, it's another big topic. You know that I think you're going to have this tolerance, religion dialogue. But the bigger issue, I think, for this region would be the extremism.
Sure.
The extremism. How we deal with that for this Southeast Asia is a big, big issue. And where China would be in that equation, where the U.S. would be, hopefully not too extreme, not coming in, you know, inciting violent reactions. How China would be. With China, you mentioned you know, why nobody cared that they took somebody from Pattaya who is a Hong Kong citizen. Well, only two countries can do that, China and the U.S. Because we know, you know, who is the big guy on the block. But that is an issue that we have to also look, when we look at the future, how to place China, the role of China, in a situation where the number one issue would not be the South China Sea, would not be you know, who gains, wins, or lose, zero-sum U.S.-China relations, sphere of influence. But this province, Daria, of the Caliphate that was announced in Mindanao, what do they call it, Dowa or something, the first province of the Caliphate outside of the Middle East, Mindanao, and how that would affect the whole region. You know, we, of course, are concerned southern Thailand, but again, this concern of Indonesia, of Malaysia, they're very concerned about that. And even Singapore has a plan that, look, if something happens, how do they close the causeway? Because all the Malaysian Chinese will be running towards Singapore, you know, if they can't control the situation in Malaysia, and that kind of thinking, which even overrides the economic kind of development in this region, the political uncertainties and what direction of governance in this region. So you have to couple that with, if we lose our focus and look at everything in terms of China, which side, good, bad, rise, how will China go? Underneath all that, we may not even have a region left anymore. And basically, China can live with it, because they're so large. US can live with it, perhaps because they're far away. But for us in this region, it's a matter of life and death. It's not choosing a way of life of the US, the soft power, the example of Hollywood or the example of China, but something that we can't even choose and we cannot even imagine looking forward, going forward 20, 30 years from now, if we don't try to prioritize those issues, those kinds of issues in this region in the more immediate future.
I'm very aware time is getting on. I know Jason needs to head off shortly. But there's a gentleman who's been waiting patiently. Let's have one last question. And if we can try and keep it brief, that would be great.
Colonel Acha Bungabu from the Armed Force. My question is almost close to what you just said, sir. But what is the greater good for all? Normal people, we just want to live in peace. We don't wish for war or superpower crashing or another country dominate. Thailand want freedom and independence decision. Okay, not the big C or the big U, US, whatever. So please, suppose you are USA, suppose you are China, Thailand, or ASEAN. What is the greater good for this region or for the world? So we can all coexist. And imagine, talk in terms of your children. We don't want, in YouTube it's full of World War III scenario. Just keep it like this. What is the greater good of all? Thank you.
How do we avoid World War III?
Well, Kissinger would say balance of power, which is, some would say that cynical, is immoral, too much realpolitik. But perhaps those in power should give more thought to this. Less infighting in the country, more thought to the future of how they arrange things internationally, how they keep the avenues, the doors open. There are some bright spots. Aung San Suu Kyi, of course, how she manages, off to China, now in the U.S. With Obama and all that. The ASEAN used to be the great hope that ASEAN could be a player together, united, 625 million people. By 2030, again, looking forward, 2030 will be the fourth largest economy in the world. Maybe they could have that balance and say, look, we are here, don't intrude, don't meddle in our internal affairs. We have a community of peace, of prosperity, where people are free to live their lives. But we see that ASEAN has a fragility, there's no common stand, no consensus, could be easily broken, and which is a shame. So first thing, of course, is to repair ASEAN, to make it more cohesive, to repair the consensus kind of rule that one can say no to 9, and then therefore dilute the strength of the 10 as a whole. After that, getting ASEAN together, community together, stronger together, then perhaps it can deal more on a level footing with China, with the US, and tell them, hey guys, look, we're going to spend one night with you, the weekend with the other guy, and don't worry about it, because we're not going to choose who we go with. But that may be the way to find this sort of common good. But along the way, some sacrifices may have to be made. Perhaps Hong Kong. Jason can move to Bangkok, certainly. He'll be welcome anytime, and bring all his people here to teach our people how to survive in the modern world. And hopefully a world in which Facebook will still be open to people to go into and not blocked. And Google, people can Google, because things have changed so much. My granddaughter, 3.5 years old now, when she asks a question and we don't know, she will say, Google it, Google it. And you take the phone and then press to look for Google and get the answer there. We are surprised. Those are the kind of things that the new generation, beyond our imagination, and perhaps that's the other answer, that technology will outpace things and assumptions of the past. Technology, for example, like there's some American guy trying to, not the Branson, but Virgin, but there was something that you can travel from one day from Bangkok to San Francisco in 5 minutes. Just going up and then down. Yeah, because when you go up, up there, there's, you can go any distance and you wait for the world to turn and then you come down again. So imagine if we are neighbors with LA or neighbors with Shanghai, how things would change, how our thinking, geopolitical thinking would change, how insignificant would be South China Sea or even the Kra Isthmus to be fighting over. So those are the technological frontiers, perhaps, that also is possible there. But we cannot take that for granted. We have to try to do things based on what we know of what has happened in the past and what we can rationally calculate will be happening soon in the near future. And I think that's the best we can do.
I think it's probably best if we wrap up here, because I know Jason has to go. he stayed well beyond his allotted time, so thank you. Well, look, thank you very much to all the panel here. Really appreciate it, and we'll see you again next time.